All right, good morning, everyone. It's good to have everybody here this morning. This morning, we're going to be looking at John and chapter 11. And while we often think of this lesson as being primarily a lesson about the death of Lazarus, the resurrection of Lazarus, I don't even want to get to that sort of territory this week in the sermon this week. Next week, we'll look at his resurrection, but I want to point out that God's timing is not our timing. And that's something it's often said or often repeated. But I think one of the most striking reminders of that is here in John chapter 11. I'm in Acts chapter 11. Let me get back over to John chapter 11 and verse 6. Where it says, "So when he heard that he was sick," this is Lazarus, when he was sick, "he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was." Man. So when Jesus got the message from the 2 sisters, the cry for help, the emergency come quickly appeal that they were making, his response was to wait for 2 days. He didn't even mention it, here in the text, to his disciples. Right? He didn't make preparations to go. He didn't get a suitcase out, right? He didn't send messengers back to say, oh, we're on our way. Right? He just stayed there. And Mary and Martha at their home in Bethany watched as their brother died. I want you to get a clear picture of what's going on this morning. Clear picture. Let's talk about Bethany real quick. It's probably a little small on this map here. But right in the center of the map where it says Judea, just north of that word Judea is the word Jerusalem. And just a couple miles outside of Jerusalem on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. So if you have Jerusalem here, you have the Mount of Olives, there's a ravine in the middle, the Kidron Valley, that one. And there is the Mount of Olives right across from Jerusalem. And then on the slope this side is Bethany. It's more of like a place, not really a city. And once you're there, you're just, a couple hours walk from Jerusalem. And the point is that you're only a couple hours walk from Jerusalem. Anything could happen this time. Last time they tried to stone him, just in the last chapter. And the Jewish leaders might actually arrest him this time if you went back. They might make good on their intentions to actually kill him. So I think it's important for us to realize that this is one of the most powerful and moving passages and events that happens in the Bible, especially in John's gospel, because John's gospel is so much different than the other ones. He's telling things, from my point of view, my understanding, my interpretation is that he's telling things in a narrative arc. Things are coming to a head. And the reason why Jesus is arrested and the reason why he's put on trial and goes to die in John's gospel is because of Lazarus, because that's what happens in the next chapter. John chapter 12. John chapter 12 is the pinnacle of John, where Isaiah's prophecies are going to be fulfilled. Jesus is going to predict his crucifixion, these sorts of things. And then the last half of the book of John, from chapter 12 to the end of chapter 21, is about 1 week. Here we have 3 years, and the rest of the book is 1 week. And so there's something important about to happen here with Lazarus. And it's not just about Lazarus. It's about Jesus. And so let's explore what it means for our picture of who Jesus is and what that means for us as well. Let's explore this Lazarus story and what he's doing here. I don't know if you follow the Bible Project. Super good folks as far as their explainer videos on the covering the books. I have to give the caveat, just like I do with everybody. They are human. They do err in some things, blah, 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 blah. So this is from their poster from John, the Gospel of John. And so chapter 11 of the Gospel of John begins with the disciples warning Jesus not to go back to Judea. And it ends, chapter 11 ends, and here in verse 50, towards the end of the chapter, with the high priest declaring that one man must die for the people. So when Jesus, later on in the chapter, thanks the Father that he heard his prayer, it's 41 and 42, I think he's referring to the prayers that he prayed during these 2 days that he was grieving over Lazarus. Or the 2 days, in chapter 10 and verse 40. He was praying for Lazarus, but he was also praying for wisdom. And he was praying for guidance in his own movements. What Jesus was going to do for Lazarus would be, on one hand, his most powerful sign yet, right? Oftentimes, it's thought of as a book of signs inside of John. There's at least 7 signs. There's 7 prominent signs within the book of John. And it sort of marks, that book of signs sort of marks out the progress through Jesus' life and what his work was all about. And here we have his greatest sign, his victory over death. But it's also a sign for the climax of the entire book of John, which is the resurrection of Christ. So there's 2 things going on here in the chapter. And so the time of waiting was important, these 2 days. And we don't see it so much here in John, but in the other Gospels, we see Jesus going off by himself to pray frequently. It's because Jesus needs to be in prayer. He needs to be exploring and asking the Father about his will and exploring the close relationship that he has with the Father and that union that he spoke about just in the last 2 chapters, right? I and the Father are one in chapter 10. It would be only after he ensured that close relationship, it would be only after that he would be willing to act. And he's not going to act in the way Mary and Martha want him to, right? But in a way that is beyond their wildest dreams. And so this story is all about ways that Jesus surprises people. And he overturns their expectations. We had that in a question in our class this morning before you guys got here. He didn't go when his sisters asked him to. He did eventually go, even though the disciples didn't want him to go. He talked about sleep, meaning death, and the disciples thought he meant ordinary sleep. And in the middle of all this, in verse 9, he told them this weird little saying, this strange little saying, that people who walk in the daytime don't trip, but that people who walk in the darkness trip. What does he mean by these things? Why is he acting so coyly? I think what he means here is that the only way to know where you are going in this life is to follow after him. If you try to steer the course of your own life by following your own understanding, you will trip and fall because you're in the dark. You're not following after the light. chapter 8 is where he says, I am the light of life. Another key word, if you ever see life in John, like 26 out of 28 times he means eternal life when he says that. So if you try and steer your own course in life, you will trip and fall because you're in the dark. But if you choose to stick with Jesus and you see the situation from his point of view, then even if it means days or years of confusion, of you wondering why nothing is happening, Lord, help me, why is nothing happening? If you're able to stick with Jesus in the light, you will come out in the right place in the end. You will come out with Jesus. And so the end of this section in verse 16, then Thomas, called Didymus, I don't know why they don't translate the Bible. Like, just translate it. Called twin. Didymus means twin. So then they called Thomas, called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, let's go too, so that we may die with him. This is the same doubting Thomas that we find later. His faith is very strong here. So the end of this section introduces us to one of John's great minor characters, if we want to call him that. Thomas is this loyal, dogged person who's ready to go, but he's also portrayed as slow to understanding things. But he's determined to go, putting one foot in front of the other at Jesus' command. If he's ready to go, I'm ready to go. And now he's going to speak these words that are heavy. These are impactful, meaningful words that are foreboding. They are telling of what's going to come. He says, let's go too, so that we can die with him. They don't die with him, of course. Spoiler alert. Or at least not yet. But I think Thomas's response here is put there for us. His response is the right response. And I think there's a great deal that we don't understand about this world. And our hopes and our plans often get defeated. Sometimes we are defeated. But if we go with Jesus, even if it's into the jaws of death, right, we will be walking in the light. Whereas if we press ahead arrogantly with our own plans and our own ambitions, right, we're going to trip. I am the resurrection and the life, Jesus says. And so whatever it is, you will know that sickening sense of wanting to turn back the clock. This is talking about when Lazarus has died, when something like that happens. Right? Have you ever watched the movie? Has anybody not watched the movie? Well, I don't know. Sort of has anybody seen Back to the Future? Right? It's about turning back the clock, going back or going forward in the future. Depends on which one you're talking about. That's why movies are made, right? Because we have this sense of wanting to go back and change things. And I think all of that and more is here as we move on to about verse 21 now. And Martha asks, if only you had been here, Lord. That's that, can we go back, Lord, type of feeling. She knows that if Jesus had been there, he would have cured Lazarus. But we find out later that Lazarus has already been dead for 3 days. So Jesus only waited 2 days, so he couldn't have actually made it. Maybe he knew that, but that's the little detail we find out now later in the story. If he'd only hurried, he could have made it. And so Jesus' reply to her And the conversation that he has with her shows her that sort of that back to the future idea of going back in time and changing something isn't just a fantasy of movie makers. It's something that we long for also. Instead of looking in the past and dreaming about what might have been but now can't be, Jesus invites her to look to the future. And then after she has looked to the future, he asks her to imagine that the future is suddenly brought forward or backwards into the present, right? This is the central belief that is core to all of Christianity and our belief about Jesus. That is the resurrection. And this passage that we're reading this morning makes the point clearly and vividly as anywhere else in the New Testament, that Jesus is bringing forward that hope of the resurrection to the now, to the here and now. And so first he's going to point her to the future, right? He says, your brother will rise again. And she knows, as well as Jesus and everybody else who was a Jew during that time, that was standard Jewish teaching, right? If we look in Daniel chapter 12, let's turn over to Daniel real quick. Ezekiel. Daniel in chapter 12, in verse 3, of course, this is Daniel's great vision. He's having a vision of Michael, the great prince, who stands watch over your people, will rise up, and there will be a time of distress, 12 verse 1, such as never occurred since the nation came into being at that time. But at that time, all your people who are found written in the book will escape. Many will sleep in the dust, the earth will awake, some to eternal life, some to disgrace and eternal contempt. Those who have insight will shine like a bright expanse of the heavens. And those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever. They're going to rise and be glorified, these people. And so they shared that vision that we read about, we don't have time for this morning, in Isaiah chapter 55 and Isaiah 65 and 66. The vision of a new heaven and a new earth. God's new world where he would dwell with his people. And it's a world like ours, with its beauty only enhanced even more. But also with the pain and the ugliness of grief, the grief of death that has been done away with. And so in a world, or let me back up, in that new world, where all of God's people from the most ancient times to the present times, they're going to be given new bodies, it says. Just like Jesus was given a new body to share and enjoy that new life in that new creation. Martha believes that, right? And her response there in verse 24, she says, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection in the last day. But she's not super comforted. She isn't prepared, though, for what Jesus is going to say to her, right? Jesus says to her, I am the resurrection and the life. This is something that's future, a future concept, abstract, and he's bringing it to the present in himself. I am the resurrection and life. Keyword, eternal life. Right? The future has burst into the present. Marty McFly from 2023 has burst into 1995, right? Or whenever it was. Jesus has not just come, as we sometimes say, or as we sing, from heaven to earth. I think it's equally true to say that he's come from God's future into the present, into the mess of what we have done with his good creation here on earth, to the mud and muck, the mire that is here on earth. And he comes in and he steps in and he says, I am the resurrection and the life. Resurrection isn't just a doctrine. It isn't just a future fact, right? It's a person, and he's standing here right in front of Martha right now. Like the question said this morning, teasing her to make that huge jump of faith, of trust, of hope. And so can we this morning then, can we take the lesson from Mary and Martha especially? Can we exchange our, if only, Lord, if only you had given me more money, more days off, more days with my husband, more time with my mother. If we can exchange that for a belief of if Jesus is who he says he is, if he is the Messiah, if he is God's own Son, if he is the resurrection in person, if we can exchange that, we can have a great hope that will comfort us in those times of grief. So the story sort of breaks off at this point, and that's where I'm going to end the lesson for this morning, but it sort of keeps us in suspense. While Martha goes to get her sister, this, of course, is the reverse of what's going to happen in the next chapter, because who goes to get her sister who's sitting at Jesus' feet? Martha is sitting at Jesus' feet, and Mary goes to go get her. So there's little narrative things that are happening here that are reversals that are designed to show us things. But that's suspense, right? Because John is this, if we think of John as this master storyteller, that suspense gives us time, or gives us space, I don't know, whatever you want to say, to think of some questions for our own self. This is one of those stories where it's not difficult for us to find ourselves as a character in. Most of us have lost a loved one at some point, right? Martha is an active, busy one. And Mary is the quieter one. Martha had to hurry off and meet Jesus and confront him directly. And many of us are like that. We can't wait. We have to tell Jesus what we think of him and his hurtful response to us. And if you're like that this morning, if you have an if only in your heart, I would encourage you to do what Martha did, to go tell it to Jesus, to meet him, tell him your problem. Ask him why he didn't come sooner, why he allowed this awful thing to happen. Because as much as we don't like it in our culture, in our society, grieving is a process. There is no pill you can take. And if you're willing to go through it, you'll come out on the other side a much stronger person. I can't predict what the response is going to be when you bring that burden to Jesus. I can't say that he's going to meet you tomorrow because he waited 2 days for one of his best friends, right? But I do know the general shape that answer will take. Jesus will meet your problem with some new part of God's future hope that is bursting onto the scene in the present time. Into the mess of grief, he bursts in with new hope, with new possibilities for us. And the key to all of that, just like it was back then, the key to that now is faith. And believing in Jesus and trusting that he is the Messiah, the one who's coming into the world for us, to bring the new creation into this world, into our pain and sorrow and death of this world. He brings hope joy and the love that he shares with the Father, he brings to come to share with us. And he offers that to us. And if you need to accept that this morning, we're willing and able to help you. If you have accepted that at some point and have rejected it, we can help you come back into that love. That's the lesson for this morning. We'll look at the second half of John chapter 11 next week. It's good to have everybody here this morning. We'll see you next time.